Welcome to The Beat, where we're going to talk today about Southern Alberta jazz and everything that comes with it. My name is Karl Schwonik, and I'm a musician, an educator, and part of the Dean's Group here at Medicine Hat College. Today we have a very special guest, a good friend of mine for several years now, and a cornerstone of this community, Lyle Rebbeck. Lyle is a producer of Medicine Hat Jazz Festival. He is a community organizer, and he is a great benefit to what's happening here in the economy in southeastern Alberta. So welcome, Lyle.
Thanks so much, Karl.
I want to start sort of on a different note. A little bit about current events, and you know, community has been in the spotlight in Canada. There was a horrific event that happened in Saskatchewan with a number of young people from a hockey team that were an unfortunate accident. And so community has been in the spotlight. Small communities, we're really learning a lot about small communities in Saskatchewan. This is a fairly small community, although not too small, but in Alberta. So tell me a little bit about community and what Medicine Hat means to you in your several decades here.
Well, that's a great question, Karl. I moved to here some 35 years ago thinking I'd be here for a couple of years and on to a university someplace. And we raised a family and you know, the rest is history. And I think it was exactly what you're talking about. It was that sense of community that right from the beginning really, you know, grabbed my attention. And the music community as well. I'm from Saskatchewan myself, but I came here from Chicago from doing a master's degree at Northwestern. And you know, was one of the biggest arts centers in North America. And yet when we moved here to Medicine Hat, I would say I took part in more community events, music events, theater events, because we took part in everything that came to town. And it really immediately started to heighten my awareness about how important community and how important everybody's involvement. And I guess that was sort of maybe one of the things that really grabbed my attention initially about the idea of the Jazz Festival and what festivals are, and that sense of celebration of community. And that really, as important as the music is, what festivals are about is getting people out to interact with one another, to meet people, to spend time together, to have those moments that lift life out of the ordinary and make it something special. And that in a nutshell is, I think, what all festivals do, and specifically what the Medicine Hat Jazz Fest and the Lethbridge Jazz Fest have done for Southern Alberta. You mentioned development a second ago, so you know, let's talk about development of young people in this community, specifically musicians. And much like, you know, most communities on the prairies have several young gentlemen who are professional hockey stars, I'm just going to assume that there are several young people from this community who have become professional musicians as well. Lots and lots of them, absolutely. And I guess the most important thing about that is, first of all, being exposed to the music, isn't it? And one of the most exciting events of Jazz Fest is a concert that we do in the Esplanade Theatre for elementary school children, bringing them in to hear one of our headliners. About 1,200 kids a year. We've been doing it now for about 8 years. So I know that for many of those young people, they go out and you can tell by the look on their face that something has happened. And each year when I welcome those young people, I say, there's a chance that one or two of you are going to end up going on into music professionally because of your experience here today. Absolutely, so that exposure, that interest is generated, and then that young person maybe starts to look for lessons, and you get them onto recordings and you know, good musicians to listen to, and you know what that's like when you get that intrinsic motivation and something comes alive and that fire is lit, then there's no stopping it.
Absolutely. And you mentioned 35 years ago, so when you moved here, did someone come up to you and say, hey Lyle, I think you should start a jazz festival? Or were you walking down the street and there was a sign that says Jazz Festival needed in Medicine Hat? I mean, how did it begin?
That's exactly it, Karl. How did you know that?
That's how they all start, I think, right?
Well, there was a group of us here at the conservatory, 4 instructors from the conservatory that got this idea as a bunch of classical players. Let's form a jazz group. And we did that. And we went up to Edmonton for the first ever Jazz Works workshop. It was in 1991 at the Yardbird Suite. That's a workshop that's still going today, I believe. So we were there for the very first one. We got to work with P.J. Perry. We got to stand on the stage with Denny Christensen and perform. Well, you know what that's like. We came back motivated, all 4 of us, and said, man, we've got to do something about this. So we got this idea to form a jazz society, and so in somebody's living room we did that. And guess who our first performer was? None other than the late, great Tommy Banks, who came down and did our first ever inaugural concert. This pillar of music and jazz in Western Canada, whose loss we're all still mourning. And we had 250 people come out from that, for that, which we thought was great at the time. And so for 6 years we did year-round programming. And then in 1997, we got this collective idea to try a festival and to connect with the other Western Canadian jazz festivals in JazzFest Canada, West Canada at the time it was called. And so we did that, and it immediately was successful. And I guess in terms of the producing part of it, I kind of fell into it. The job immediately became quite a large undertaking. And so I said, okay, I'll head it up. Everybody's going to have to pitch in and we'll do it together. Well, you know what that's like. It became immediately clear that either, I was going to jump in there or not. Yeah. And gradually, bit by bit, I began to discover what a gift this festival and this production was for me, and how in many ways, maybe it was my reason for being here. Initially, it was maybe a little bit, reluctantly to say, okay, well, I'll head this up. As often, the great gifts in life are, it kind of came hidden under a blanket, and that's sort of, where it originated.
So you've mentioned now a few different festivals. You mentioned Lethbridge, Edmonton, West Can, and that kind of thing. So tell me about your relationship with the other festivals in Canada. So if I go to Lethbridge, is it the exact same festival as yours? You know what I'm saying? How do you interact, and what's the relationship?
Well, we have got a great organization of festivals in Canada that's called Jazz Festivals Canada. West Can was its original name, and it was all Western festivals. And quite some time ago, it became an organization of festivals right across the country. We live in a big country with huge miles and distances between us. So one of the big functions of that organization is networking. So collectively, what we try to do is support similar artists and groups and network them from festival to festival, so coordinate. So Victoria and Vancouver and Edmonton and Calgary and Lethbridge and Regina and Medicine Hat and Saskatoon and Edmonton and Winnipeg and across out to Toronto and Montreal and right out to the East Coast. So from an artist point of view, if they can fly from Toronto out to Calgary and play 4 or 5 festivals, that's way more worth their while than coming out and doing one. And right from the very beginning, we associated ourselves with that network of festivals. And it's really been a great tool for just exactly that, making artists available to us that we wouldn't have otherwise. Just this morning, I pulled up the very first brochure from our very first festival in 1997. And one of the groups we presented was a group called Junk from San Francisco. Well, I guarantee you, we didn't fly them up here from San Francisco. We got them because they were networking their way through.
Let's talk a little bit more about artists. So what do artists say about your festival, whether it's to your face or not? But what are they saying about Southern Alberta and the jazz that we exhibit here?
Well, I think one of the things that we hear consistently about our festival is that they really appreciate the fact that we're still pretty much a jazz festival. We have focused on that genre. We have honored the up-and-coming musicians and really tried to develop that and support that. And we've really tried to make the festival about the artists, to use the best venues we can that are most conducive to listening and experiencing music, the best equipment that we possibly can, and treating the artists really well. We're 3 hours from an international airport, so something we do is run a shuttle every day back and forth between Medicine Hat and Calgary to pick the artists up at the airport and bring them here. Without that, we probably couldn't have done what we've done. For many, many years, we provided a home-cooked meal for our artists. We still do that through a caterer, which is so appreciated for our visiting artists. And, we've got that small-town touch that, people here we are small-town friendly. Artists, come to me at the end of the day and say, I asked for directions downtown today, and whoever asked me actually took me to the coffee shop and bought me a coffee. those kinds of things happen regularly. So I think there's this sense of honoring the music and them as musicians understanding it. Believe it or not, we're in our 22nd year now. After all these years, we've developed a pretty astute audience for jazz. When we do our late series every night at 10:30 at night, and it's kind of okay, let's settle in and get serious about jazz. Audience members are really listening, and they know what they're listening for, and they respond, and the artists get that immediately. Yeah. Oh, they're responding to what I do. There's that sense of honoring. So I think from my perspective, that's something I've noticed. But I guess I could throw the question back to you, Karl. You've been a visiting musician at our festival.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what has been your experience at the festival? Not on the spotlight at all here.
Well, but exactly that, though. Exactly that. I have found that the folks that are patrons of your festival, they truly are there for the music. I've played it on festivals all over the world, and some of the bigger ones too. And sometimes it's just a tourist attraction, which in itself is great. And that's one vibe. And that's more of the celebrity vibe that you get when you play those. You play the main stage, and people are like, oh, I don't care who you are, but this is great. But at your festival, it's more like people do care who you are. They are listening, and they are interested in the music. That's a totally different vibe when you're playing. There's a greater connection with the audience in that way. Mm-hmm. But there's something I wanted to challenge you on, and something you just said a second ago. As you know, jazz has changed a lot since its inception, maybe 100 years ago, or a bit less than 100 years ago. And it's changed especially a lot since maybe the festival started in 1997. That was a pivotal year, actually, for a lot of things that were happening in jazz, contemporary jazz at the time. And you mentioned that your festival has stayed true to jazz and true to roots and that kind of thing. So if I attend your festival, is it all traditional jazz? I'm going to be back in the 1940s, or explain to me where you see yourself in that.
Yeah, that's a great question, Karl, because there is no definitive answer to that question. But I think that there is something, as jazz has developed and as jazz has grown, there are aspects of the music which have remained true. One of them, of course, would be a strong emphasis on improvisation, which has always been the heartbeat of true jazz. Yeah. There's been this sort of spontaneity. There's been this sense of connection between the artist, that the music is alive and dynamic, and it's different every time. And there's those, on maybe a bigger, maybe more philosophical level, I could say, whether it swings or not, there's something about this underlying sense of does it swing or not. And a musician, I think, would understand what I'm saying. Doesn't mean that it has to be going dong, dunk a dong, dunk a dong, but that there's something about the music that pays some homage to that background of music. But it's not easily defined because the genre is very broad now. One of the most popular groups now making its way around the world is a group by the name of Snarky Puppy, and everybody wants to be Snarky Puppy. And it's like 8 to 10 young people playing this really hypnotic, electronic, driven, strong, almost jazz / rock / what. And how does that relate to Duke Ellington or to Count Basie? But if you ask those young people, what's your background? I know what they'd say. It's jazz in some way. Jazz would be a part of what they would say. We have a group coming to our festival this year by the name of Frizen out of the United States that I think potentially could be the next Snarky Puppy. It's that kind of energy. We feature musicians from Cuba and Latin American music. And so there's a broad sense. But I guess the sense with our festival is that it's broad and it's not so easily defined. But we know, for instance, that if we book Willie Nelson or we book Paul Simon, that we've maybe made a shift to another genre. Not to say that they can't also be wonderful musicians in their own right, but
Sure. So talk to me a little bit more about the bigger names. So you mentioned a couple big names now, but you mentioned Tommy Banks earlier and Snarky Puppy and that kind of thing. So what kind of big names have you had at the festival in the past? And is this sort of is it a priority for you to get the larger names into Medicine Hat, or what's your philosophy as producer in that side?
I would say that for several years, the lure of that big name hung, fairly significantly, and there was that sense that, well, how do we get there? We've got to get those, bigger corporate sponsors. How do we do that? And then, without going into too much detail, I think it's been clear over the years that sometimes with some festivals, that can have a potential side effect that maybe is not always necessarily desirable. Those headliners are headliners for the most part because they've deserved it, they've earned it. They're great players, and they come with a big price tag. And so they come with a big gamble as well. So right from the beginning, it became clear that we were not going to land those same huge corporate sponsors that the big festivals were. So what do? So our approach was to build this grassroots local sponsors, people who invested money, who cared about the festival and cared about it locally. But it also meant that our budget had to be realistic with that as well. And along with that, we started to realize that some of those great players, those young players that nobody had heard of before, but that you could tell when you put the CD on, wow, these guys have got it. And we booked them. And 2 or 3 or 4 years later, the rest of the world started to realize it. Michael Kasehammer first performed at our festival his first year here from Germany.
Wow.
He just arrived here from, nobody knew who he was in Canada. We had him booked. He's pretty well known now. The very first festival that Sophie Millman ever performed at was our festival. And she performed here the same night that we had booked the runner-up to Canadian Idol in the main theater. That sold out within hours, and Sophie played to, probably 50 or 60 people over in the black box, and nobody knew who she was. So, those are some of the great moments. That doesn't mean that I don't take those opportunities when I can to bring some of those great performers. I was thrilled to be able to present Arturo Sandoval here a few years ago. And Arturo has a big name because he's a big player and he deserves that recognition. And it was a thrill to have him on our stage.
Yeah.
One of the greatest experiences of my production life was standing backstage with Paquito de Rivera when we first presented him here. And he walked out onto the stage of the Esplanade Theater in his bare feet with his wooden clarinet and started playing these Brazilian classical clarinet concertos with the piano player, who immediately recognized them and started playing along. And he started to recognize the acoustics of our space and was playing to it. And I was as close as I am to you standing there watching him play. He's got a name because he's a really, really great player. I stood this close backstage to Charles Neville with the Neville Brothers,
Yes.
who is an incredibly serious jazz tenor saxophone player. You don't hear that on stage when he's playing with his brothers. He's a great player, but he was playing bebop in a serious way backstage, and I got to hear that. So, those are wonderful opportunities, but I'm just as thrilled to put on that CD of that player that's just on their way and has all the tools. And I think as festivals, if we're not recognizing that and promoting that and presenting that, well, who's going to be doing that? Is that not what we should be doing? So I take great delight in filling that role in giving those deserving players a stage.
So just now you mentioned a transplant from Germany. You mentioned a musician from Cuba, a Puerto Rican transplant to New York, someone from Toronto. What about the musicians on the prairies? And do you have a connection to them, or do you have an obligation to them, or what is your relationship there?
I think both. I think a connection and an obligation. We have developed a jazz scene in Medicine Hat and Lethbridge, absolutely. We know that Calgary and Edmonton have very vibrant jazz scenes. And as the producer of the Medicine Hat Festival, I've always considered, Calgary musicians especially to be kind of like my local, players in a way. So I think you could go back through the program over the 22 years, and I don't think you would find a single year where we haven't presented Alberta musicians at our festival, and I consider them, to be absolutely important as headliners and with their own groups, And it's also a great delight to be able to bring in, say, a performer from Toronto, and they fly in and we hook them up with a band from Calgary, and they perform. I was, thrilled a few years ago to bring the great Lee Konitz to Medicine Hat and hook him up with some Alberta musicians who were quite, I think, starstruck at the opportunity to play with this legend and to stand on the stage of the Esplanade Theatre and to interact with this guy. So absolutely, I think that that promotion and that development and that support of local and Alberta and Canadian artists is high on the priority list.
So with that, keeping in that theme, and something that I do a lot of my work and my research and some of the work that I do, you're talking about local and you're talking about Alberta. So talk to me about the economy. Does the festival have any role in the economy? I mean, are you a benefit or are you a detriment to the economy? Are you arts for art's sake? What do you play in the community, in the economy?
Right. Well, the simple answer is that we are absolutely a vibrant part of the economy of our city. And I think probably as most, well, I'll speak only for myself. I probably got into this because of that art for art's sake, because I know the value of the arts and I know what they do. And I see it and I value it. In 2003, the City of Medicine Hat funded an economic impact study on the festival. That's 15 years ago, and at that time we were bringing $250,000 in new money into the city. That was an eye-opener for all of us. So that's not people from Medicine Hat going out, that's people coming from other cities. In those past 15 years, our festival has grown incrementally. Not only in size, but in the number of out-of-town guests and artists that we bring to our city. So in bringing those figures forward, it's easy to say that between $500,000 and $750,000 comes into the city every year because of JazzFest.
Substantial standalone money, yeah, that wouldn't be there without the festival. And so with that in mind, tell me about someone from our community. I mean, we talked about hockey earlier, right? And there's a lot of things that drive rural communities, and hockey's a big factor there. But the arts can be as well. And so what would you say to maybe an audience member who's maybe never come to an event, or maybe they came one time to somebody who they had heard of, or, say, what would you say to that person in terms of, coming to future events and what they could expect?
Right. Well, of course, we've faced that and have always faced that because it's quite common to say, what do you do? Well, I'm the producer of the Jazz Festival. And the response is, oh, well, I'm not really a jazz fan. And I understand that. You're not listening to Charlie Parker records, during the day. But on the other hand, I've never had anybody come to Jazz Festival and say, oh, well, I don't like that. The response almost always is, oh, well, if that's jazz, I like that. So in terms of the musical style, there's something, even though it might not be something that immediately grabs you like that's my favorite music ever, it's music that offends few, I think. But I think more importantly than that, we started to realize that there's two components to the word JazzFest. There's jazz and there's festival. And that festival component is that component that recognizes the value of community. And that music might be the campfire that you gather around, but it's what happens around that campfire that is also equally important. It's that interaction with people, it's community building, it's fun, it's, well, can you imagine the idea of taking 1,000 to 2,000 people and going to the top of a bus terminal parkade with a band and with food and perhaps even a beer and a glass of wine and having a party? Can you imagine? We do that every year. And that sort of sense of playfulness and of discovery that people might remember, for the rest of the year or for the rest of their life. A couple of years ago, we went out to one of the big airport hangars at the airport. And, people walk around the corner and come and they look at that huge big hangar and the door open and the music set up and go, is this Medicine Hat? Like, it's, who got this idea? It's this playfulness so, and interestingly, as that begins to unfold and people begin to fall in love with that idea of a festival, one by one, we find that they also start to discover what it is about jazz music that's so intrinsically captivating. And I mentioned earlier about this late series that we do. We start a series every night of the festival at 10:30 at night. Well, initially everybody said, "Are you kidding me?" And I would just say to them, "Okay, so you're in New York City. You've gone out to a Broadway play. You've had a meal. You're walking down the street and you hear some jazz coming from a club. Do you look at your watch and say, 'Oh, honey, it's 10:30. It's bedtime'?" Absolutely not. You're there, right? And you know what? That same group that was playing there, they're playing tonight at 10:30 right over there. And one by one, people start to discover that. And that series, where I would say the more, I want to say serious in terms of improvisation, young up-and-coming players playing their original music, that's where that happens. That series grows every year. It's not uncommon for us to have over 100 people on a Monday or a Tuesday night at 10:30 at night sitting in the Studio Theater at the Esplanade listening to jazz. And once that connection is made, that recognition of what's going on with the improvisation, the connection between the musicians, then they're sold. Then your job is done. All you have to do is put the pass on sale next year and they buy it. And so, you know, as that's happened, I think that sort of sense of appreciation and understanding. So, you know, back to the original question, it would be, first of all, the festival aspect, which is a huge amount of fun. There's something for families, for kids. There's patios. There's any kind of serious to very, you know, entertaining type music. But secondly, I would say give it a chance. Give it a chance. Because we are quite seriously presenting the same musicians that you might hear not only across Canada but around the world. And you might come home and rave to your neighbors about this group that you heard when you were in New Orleans or you're in New York or you happen to be in Paris. It's the same group. It really is. I'm not just saying that. And they're here. You don't have to travel.
Get the bragging rights in your community. We've talked a lot about the past, so let's talk a little bit about the future. So first tell me, what do you see in jazz or in music in general, some of the future trends that we might be encountering in the next decade or so?
Wow, that's a very difficult question to answer, Karl. But I will say, whatever it is, it's encouraging. I see incredibly talented musicians and young people continually being bit by the jazz and improvisation bug. I don't see it waning. I don't see it. You know, I think as a society, maybe over the past, what would you say, 5, 6, 8 years, there was this sort of blip in popularity of jazz and hearing it on the overheads in the Bay and all that sort of thing. That kind of thing comes and goes. But in terms of the quality of the musicians, and I think, like you said, this expansion, this elasticity of the genre, and connecting maybe with a younger generation. You know, the university crowd know who Snarky Puppy is. My son, who's in his 20s, is texting me all the time with, you know, groups that are coming through the Arbor Suite in Edmonton or you know, that he's been listening to and coming across and saying, "Dad, have you booked these guys? And, you know, check it out." So there is that passing on of the music. I'm delighted that there are still players who still love that great traditional classic jazz because it's a genre that's so rich, but I'm delighted to see how it expands and finds its way. And you know, the young, well, you know, you're one of those people, Karl, of those great Canadian jazz writers and performers and band leaders who every time you come out with a recording, there's something new, there's something interesting and dynamic there.
Absolutely. And it's interesting your comment about ebbing and flowing too in terms of popularity and sort of mass popularity, because I think in Canada it can almost be pinned to certain names. For example, we've seen some ebbs and flows around Diana Krall's career. We've seen some around Michael Bublé's current career, another Canadian. And it's fascinating to see how that permeates into society as the whole.
I know.
Beyond even the festival circuit or those in the know or the college crowd. So it's interesting.
It is, and in fact, that's one of the answers to that statement about I don't like jazz. And because if you say, well, do you like Michael Bublé, what's the answer going to be?
Right.
Well, everybody does, right?
It's very popular, yeah. Absolutely. And so then moving over to future trends in the festival, and so what are some of the things that either you want to accomplish or that you see happening within the festival, let's say in the next 5-10 years, and I assume you expect it to be happening in the next 5-10 years still.
I hope so, absolutely. I've always seen this festival as a gift to Southern Alberta, to the city of Medicine Hat and to the city of Lethbridge and the Southern Alberta, that somehow it's putting something positive back into the community. And that's what I envision it continuing to do. Even if it's not necessarily winning more and more and more converts, that there's something about the presence of this festival that's bringing something positive to our community. And maybe it sounds overly romantic, but somebody sits at a concert and they have a great time and they go out feeling really good and they drive home and they decide to wave at that person who cuts them off. Those kinds of little tiny things that I really think that that value to it. I would love to see more and more and more people in our cities attending the festival and getting that firsthand, and that happens bit by bit every year, absolutely. And I think that we have a city, I can speak especially for Medicine Hat, but I think Lethbridge would say the same thing, that is ripe for cultural tourism. I think all of the aspects are in place and happening already, and I would love to see on a larger scale our cities embracing that and recognizing that. The value that it brings not only to the quality of life, but to the economy of the city, and how we've got all the bits in place for that really to be like one of our serious calling cards. And I think, along with that, sunniest city in Canada and walking trails and Medelta and all of these wonderful things that we have in place, that the arts are pretty powerful in their potential for our community. And I would just love to see that continue to develop and be a part of that.
And it sounds like you feel events like this and their offshoots are really hitting on those three main pillars of ROI, of return on investment: the economic, the social, and the intrinsic side. Because I think you've given us examples from all three of those categories, and overwhelmingly positive examples. So am I reading that correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well done, economist.
Yeah. So there's obviously many components in a jazz festival. I mean, we've talked a lot about the musicians. You're the producer. I'm assuming you have possibly some employees as well, and there's many sponsors and partners that you have. I assume you also have volunteers. And it's been my experience that it takes actually a fairly substantial fleet of people, volunteers, partners, and that kind of thing to run a festival. Is that the same here?
Yeah, it is. I think that this city has gotten a really good bang for its buck in terms of lots of volunteer input to this festival. Outside of myself and a part-time office manager, that's really it in terms of staff. We have a committee that works for the most part from February through the festival. That's 7 or 8 people that commit a significant amount of time. At the festival time itself, we have upwards of 100 volunteers that come on board to help deliver that festival, and they really become the face of the festival to the community. We have volunteer coordinator. We have venue coordinators out of each of our places that we work with, and when the festival comes on board, production managers and all that kind of thing. But I think it's that local involvement, that's that volunteer coordinator, that retired dentist who decides to take the week and just drive musicians around, or whatever it happens to be. In the past we've had volunteers who have started talking to the musicians and telling them a little bit about the surrounding area, and then interest is gained, and that volunteer says, well, what are you doing tomorrow? I'll drive you around. Let's go see it. Let's go down to Medelta. Let's go out to Echodale. You want to go for a drive? Oh, you need some laundry done? And yeah, we'll do that. So those kinds of things are just such an important part, because as a musician, and you're flying around and you're staying in hotels and you're performing and you're on the airplane, to arrive at a place where you really feel that there's that sort of local, personal touch has been a huge part. And we've got a great community. We've got a friendly community who really know what small town hospitality is all about.
And that integration can only make the festival better, in my opinion. I mean, there's nothing worse than being an artist, flying into a city, and there's no one at the airport, which in itself is not a problem, but there's no one at the airport. Then you go to the hotel, they don't have your reservation because something happened at the festival, and then you're supposed to go to the venue, there's no one there to pick you up, and you're at the venue and they don't have your name. There's nothing worse than that.
Right.
And that's the complete opposite of what you're talking about. That's the opposite of integration. In fact, that's separation.
Right. Well, I mean, obviously what we want is for you as an artist to arrive on stage feeling really good about everything.
Yes.
You're rested, you're fed, you feel good because you've been reinforced that people are wanting you there and happy to have you there, and things have gone along seamlessly. Then you can sit down at your instrument and just be completely and totally there. And so that's absolutely what we want. That seems the right thing to do.
So tell me, how can people find out more information if they want to be involved in the festival, whether they want to buy a ticket or volunteer or see if their child is going to your large school show? How would they know?
Right. Well, the websites will be posted. Medicine Hat JazzFest.com is the Medicine Hat Fest, and there's a Lethbridge web site as well, which is easy to find. And we're on all social media, Med Hat Jazz, and on Twitter and Instagram. And unlike maybe a festival where the pass gets you into an event, if there's any tickets left, ours is the opposite. If you buy a pass, we pull a ticket from every single show, so you're guaranteed a seat into everything. And so lots of people have really loved that. So we're always opening our doors to volunteers, to sponsors, of course, to supporters of the festival. It's a great community event to get involved with. Whether you think you're interested in jazz or not is not necessarily the point. It's a local festival. And we all know what festivals are like. We drive to other cities for them all the time because they're so great. We plan our summer holidays around them. They become pivotal events in our lives. And we've got that here. And so we always welcome more involvement and encourage you to give it a try.
That's terrific. And that's one of the things that I've found about Medicine Hat is that it's often a city where you don't have to drive those 3 hours to Calgary or however many to Regina to get those experiences, whatever they may be. Medicine Hat is truly a beacon in this part of our province. And a lot of great things happen here, which is terrific.
They do, and when people drive from Calgary or Edmonton or Saskatoon, as they do to come to our festival, they tell us one of the main reasons why is parking is cheap, and you can walk between venues. All of our venues are close in proximity downtown, and there is that sort of small town friendliness, and it's common. It's not the exception. It's common that you're going to be sitting close to the performer, and you'll almost be guaranteed that you can go and chat with them at the break or afterwards and meet them and talk to them, and you might even run into them at the coffee shop down the street a little bit later. So there is really that attraction, and when people do come from a larger center to our festival, it's that. And often they say to me, it feels like, the festival descended on the whole city. I can't go anywhere without, feeling it and seeing it.
You have the monopoly in that week.
Yeah.
Okay. So Lyle, talk to me a little bit more about logistics. So, you're talking about all the venues downtown and the Esplanade and the late night sessions and that kind of thing. There's obviously a lot of moving parts here, right? So festivals such as yours and such as Lethbridge, I mean, what can I expect as a patron? Am I going to the Esplanade every night, or what am I doing?
Right. So for the week of JazzFest, music is running. Sometimes it starts as early as 10 or 11 in the morning in some of the clubs. Certainly by noon, there's music happening. And for the most part, you could do something right up till 1 or 2 in the morning. There's often that we run some music on the street in front of Tim Hortons downtown. We have a whole clubs and pubs section, which basically is individual club owners in town booking jazz, and we advertise it for them. And it's not even jazz, it's just live music, whatever it happens to be. So, you know, it might be that your local place that you go to all the time through that week has got jazz happening, maybe in the afternoon, maybe in the evening, various times through the day. We do workshops quite often in the afternoon, usually about 2 o'clock in the afternoon down in the Esplanade, and that's a chance to just talk to those musicians and say, how do you do what you do? How do you write a piece of music? What is it that's happening between you and the bass player? How did you get interested in jazz? Whatever it happens to be. And then we often have a feature show at 7:30. It might be in the Esplanade Main Theater. It might be out at the airport hangar for the dance party. And then, as I've mentioned before, there's a late night series that runs starting at 10:30. So for our festival, and the same thing for the Lethbridge Festival, there's music that's happening throughout the community throughout the day. And you know, it's cliche to say something for everybody, but they're time-wise, genre-wise, setting, whether you like a nice, comfortable theater and a glass of wine before you go in, or you like a patio, or you like standing on the street corner, a dance party. There really is a wide variety of music happening through the week. It is a smorgasbord of music through the week.
And you were mentioning before that several of the festivals are connected, but at the same time they are unique. So if I'm driving over to Lethbridge maybe for their festival, I'm going to have a unique experience there too.
Yeah, absolutely. Their festival, and the festival in Lethbridge happens earlier in the month of June, so there's no interference in terms of time. And they've just recently rebranded the festival to be a jazz and blues festival, and reflective of the genres that are supported there. So if you look at the programs, you're going to find different performers, and our cities are so close. What a great opportunity to be able to experience. Well, it's Jazz in June, right? It's happening, and then add into the mix the Jazz YYC concert. That's a festival that's happening now in Calgary, and what a great a bunch of music that's happening through June in southern Alberta.
Okay, thanks very much for joining us, Lyle.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And thank you all for joining us on The Beat. We talk about jazz here in southern Alberta. And for more information on the Lethbridge and Medicine Hat Jazz Festivals that we spoke about today, see the websites on the screen. Thank you.
Thank you.